Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement. I am your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm happy to be back with you again this week. This is the podcast that helps law enforcement officers overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. This week on the podcast, what true healing even means? How do we deal with unprocessed trauma? What is unconscious autopilot? And how important is proper breathing? All that and more this week's On the Blue Line podcast starts now. So welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. This is another The Interview Room, and here I sit down with guests from different walks of life, and I get to have great conversations with them. Sorry if you have been a longtime follower, you're probably like, why is there not regular content? Well, I answered that in a previous episode, but I am trying to get it out to you as soon as possible. In full disclosure, as I always do, some of these were recorded quite some time ago, but I assure you that all the content is going to come to you. And fortunately, a lot of, especially these interview rooms, is evergreen content. So you're not missing anything. Things happen when they're supposed to happen. So this content is getting out to you, and it's always fresh content. I know there's probably differing thoughts on from a business perspective. People are like, well, why don't you take your old episodes and reissue them and so forth? If you're a binge listener to podcasts like I am, there's nothing more annoying to listening to an episode and then going back, a year's worth of their stuff and been like, didn't I just hear this episode? Anyway, that drives me crazy. So rather than doing that, all the content when it gets released is new content. However, some of it may have been recorded some time ago. The good news is I feel like we are getting to a point where this content will be more regular again and get us to the next level with what we're trying to create here at ontheblueline.com. If this is your first time joining us, for more on what that is, just go to ontheblueline.com, and that is all about the On the Blue Line podcast. So On the Blue Line, that's O-N, ontheblueline.com. For the sake of this episode, I want to get right into it. This week, I sit down with Amanda Monnier. She transitioned into her soul work from a career in law enforcement after feeling the nudge to go all in on her mission work. She's an energy healer, a breathwork facilitator. She's the podcast host of New Earth Visionaries and a certified yoga teacher. And if you have been listening to the show for any length of time, you know that what I like to bring you is practical information, especially when we talk about mental health, when we talk about wellness, when we talk about a holistic approach to life. And that's exactly what Amanda is doing. So she's here. She's been quoted as saying she helps people release from their inner struggle, lack of confidence, low self-esteem, and burnout and codependency. I think you're going to enjoy this episode. So without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, Amanda Monnier. Well, Amanda, welcome to the show.
Hi, Wayne. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you reached out on social media and we could sit down and have this conversation. So I think some really helpful things for law enforcement is going to come out of it.
Yeah, and that's my intention. So whatever I can share, I'm happy to share here. So
it's awesome. Well, let's start, as I always do, with some get to know you questions. Real simple: coffee or tea?
Ooh, coffee.
Okay. Now, is it black coffee, or are we talking like a latte or a mocha, or what kind of coffee do you like?
It's definitely going to have a hint of sweet, but I don't like a bucket of sugar also. So definitely not black, kind of in the middle there. If I'm ordering something to be half sweet.
That sounds good. Now, I have to ask, when you say half sweet like that, so are we actually talking sugar, or are we talking like agave or something like that?
So my go-to right now, I'm actually on prep for my first fitness show. So I'm not drinking the sugary lattes and all the things, but if I could have any coffee I want, it's going to be a vanilla latte, half sweet.
Okay, perfect. Well, my follow-up question always is, where's your favorite place to have that drink? Like that peaceful spot to just enjoy a sip of coffee?
Oh, I love that. There's this coffee shop in Orange, which is about 20 minutes away from me. My friends always like, why do you drive 20 minutes to go get coffee? I'm like, because it's so great there. Yeah. So they have the best coffee, and then they have the best burger. It's like a little cafe, but they have amazing food and coffee. So definitely, it's called True Brew in Orange. It's in California. Favorite spot.
Well, any of the California listeners will have to check that out. And anyone else who goes and visits, of course. It is funny to me when you say that people give you a hard time. I'll drive 45 minutes to an hour to go to some place I want to go or further, like in the state of Florida, because we talked that I'm here in Central Florida, driving halfway across state or all the way across state, because it only takes you 2 hours to get over to the other coast. I'll do it all the time. But people will be like, you're going to go 15 minutes for that? It's like, yeah. It's so funny to me.
Way. Yeah. Definitely the foodies.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing. If you really enjoy it, like if you enjoy that moment, you're willing to drive for it.
Same here. I'm with you.
So I have to ask you, what is your best or worst travel story?
Ooh, this one's the one that just came up. We'll go with that. So I actually went on a trip. Sorry if you're listening, with my friend and her family. We're going to the Bahamas. It was actually my first time out of the country. And it was her husband and their 2 children, her parents and their son. And we get there and one of the son, it was like probably 3 days into the trip, and they had to call the Bahama police on him. Oh, no. They had to call the cops because he was just out of control. I think he just turned 21. And so I actually ended up, I was like, I'm out, guys. And a couple days later, I left and I ended up being like, well, vacation's not over. I had a pup sitter, I was watching my dog. So I'm like, I just flew to Scottsdale. And I was like, I'm just going to finish my vacation in Scottsdale. But I was like, I'm out.
Wow.
That one was interesting. I'm like, here I am sitting there. Cause at the time I was actually working in law enforcement. I was a probation officer. And I'm like, here I am sitting here with the Bahama police, like coming to the home while we're supposed to be enjoying ourselves and drinking like Mai Tais and all the things. And I'm like, yeah, this ain't my vibe. I'm out. Yeah.
That's one of those things in law enforcement, right? Like you have that moment where something's going on and you're like, this is not a world I want to be in with my current career. So y'all have a good day.
Nothing good can happen from this.
Exactly. Yeah, I've been there myself. So do you have a favorite or most meaningful modern nonfiction book?
The first book that popped into my mind, I don't even know if this counts for what you're asking, but it's one I read recently. It's called Breath by James Nestor. And it's about, this is a blonde moment here. Is this even nonfiction? But he talks about breath work and how important it is, and actually how the science of breath work he just brings in this amazing science into it, and actually how the human skull has changed because of mouth breathing. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard that term. Oh, he's a mouth breather. Yeah. And I didn't realize that it was actually kind of like a jab or whatever, because breathing in and out of the mouth is actually not good for us. And there's a bunch of science behind it. So that's the first book that popped into mind.
Well, that is a perfect, yes, that is a nonfiction. Well, the reason I add all those qualifiers is otherwise you get 2 things. If I just say what's your favorite book, 2 things happens. Half the people are always going to say Bible because they feel guilty if they say otherwise. And so that's why I add modern.
Not me.
Right. But you know what I mean? And then the other half is, then the other thing you get is everyone mentions their own books, which we get to later in the conversation. But I try to qualify it so much just to try to come up with other ideas like this one. So this is a great one.
So great.
Trying to think of the name of it, but I recall a couple years ago hearing of a book where this was the whole premise of it, where they talked about the whole mouth breathing and how important it is to do that deep diaphragm breathing as well, because that's the other problem is shallow breathing. And I don't know if he goes into it, but the other problem is so many of us shallow breathe, which is an issue too, which we'll probably get into as we talk about law enforcement and some of the trauma response and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was funny. I one of my breathwork guides, like a class I was taking, he was actually shared that the breath is often indicative of the lifespan. He said that turtles take like a couple breaths per minute, dogs, and they live like over 100 years, some of them. And then dogs breathe so shallowly, like so shallow, and they're like, often panting, and they have shorter lifespans. And so he's like, we brought in some really cool like science around that and data around that. I was like, oh, that's fascinating, but it made sense.
It absolutely does. That's kind of cool. I will definitely check that book out. So the last of these questions, where is that place that brings you the most peace? What is your favorite spot to kind of stop, breathe, and enjoy life?
Ooh, Orange County, Huntington Beach.
Okay. Yeah, so definitely a beach girl.
That's the reason I moved to, which I'm sure we'll get into my leaving law enforcement, but I ended up in Southern California. I've always felt this pull towards the ocean, and I'm like 20 minutes from there at this point. So if I need a recharge or a refresh, I'm going to Huntington, and it's one of the most magical places to me. So
awesome. Yeah, it's powerful. For me, it's right up there next to the mountains. I
yeah.
love, now in Florida, you have both. You have the Gulf side, which is different, but I love the other coast, the east coast of Florida, where you have the waves and you really get that peace that comes from that.
Yeah, I love both. It's good.
So from here, let's kind of move into your origin story. You teased it a little bit that you had worked in probation, but you start as early as you want with kind of what took you into law enforcement, and then we'll segue from there to kind of what took you out of it.
Yeah, it's actually really funny because I didn't even know what probation was. I got undergraduate degrees in psychology and in criminal justice. And the reason I ended up in criminal justice was I took I think it was criminal law 101. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I changed my major from kinesiology to criminal justice. And I had no idea why at the time. My dad was
interesting.
Like, oh. Yeah.
Where'd you go to school at?
Sacramento State University.
Okay. All right.
Mm-hmm. So I ended up I was like, okay, I'm going to double major. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I don't know what it's going to look like. My dad really was advocating for law school. And I at one point thought about it, but I had finished my time at Sacramento State and started applying for jobs as we do when we're done with our 4-year degree. I ended up working at an inner city school as a school counselor, but I had even forgotten I'd applied to Placer County probation department. And then I get a call about a year after I'd applied, and they're asked if I was interested in coming in. And I immediately thought I was going to have to work in institutions and work at the hall. So I was kind of I was open to it, and I scheduled the interview, but I actually almost canceled the interview because I didn't have a desire to work in a juvenile hall. So I had the interview, they offered me the job, entered into backgrounds immediately. And within probably 3 or 4 months, it was a really quick turnaround for my backgrounds, ended up working at the probation department. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I knew a little bit because I had done a short internship, but it was at a local police department, but it was more with the social work department, with the social work team working with kids. It was an RPAL. I don't know if you guys have something similar. So a PAL where they have the police activities league and work with all the kids and stuff like that. So it was, I was kind of tied into this, but I wasn't fully, and I had never shot a gun, none of that stuff. I was super green. It was just one of those things where I had no idea what to expect, which I guess was both maybe good and bad. But I started working at the probation department, and it was several months in, I was like, I love this job. I'm never going to leave. This job is designed perfectly for me. This is so great. And started getting into the trainings and things like that. So that was kind of the segue into the career. And there were many times where I was I'm never going to leave this job. And lo and behold, that wasn't the case. But,
right.
But yeah, it was very, very, I learned so much during that career.
Okay. Now, I don't honestly know. So it was in California. So probation probably works a little differently out there. So is it certified? Because you mentioned firing a gun and so forth. So are you guys armed and you're then assigned individuals who are on probation? Is that kind of how that works? Or
yeah, so we had so we didn't go through the post academy or anything. It was kind of segmented training. So we had our own academy that was, if I recall, 6 weeks, I believe. And then we had a firearms training. I believe that one was about a week. We had our RCB, our baton training. So it was all definitely it was a lot of in-house, but also not. So they pieced it instead of having 1 6-month academy that, most of the officers here in at the police departments go through. We just had our in-house training. So it was definitely different than, and I had never, like I said, I never shot a gun. I never done any of that, none of the defensive tactics training. So it was definitely, it was all new to me, but it became something where I really started to enjoy it. And I learned a lot about just kind of awarenesses that you have to have in this sort of space. So it was definitely interesting process in the training portion, which it was actually started training once I started. So it wasn't prior to. So it was even, I look back on it and I'm like, we need an FTO program. I remember it was my first week on the job, and I'm going into houses, and I'm not armed at that time. And it was just like, so it probably was not, looking back, I know it wasn't a good way that they kind of funneled that out. But to answer your question about the people, so yeah, we would have a caseload depending on the assignment. So probation officers actually are part of the pretrial process. So they're writing the pre-sentence investigation. And this is in California. I don't know if it's different. I'm sure there's maybe differences and little nuances throughout the country, but they would write the pre-sentence investigation and a recommendation. And if the person was to go to, CDCR or whatever it was, that was all part of probation. And then we would do pretrial supervision. And then we would have, if the person was placed onto probation, then we would do that piece of the supervision. So actually my entire career, I was doing that supervision piece. So I worked with any defendants anywhere from domestic violence to, felony mixed bag of stuff. I worked with the homeless population out of a local police department for 2 years. That was very interesting stories there. And it was just kind of dependent on what they needed, but they would assign us to different caseloads. So we would be going into houses, we would be doing, DUI. We had a DUI team and that sort of thing. So it was very well encompassed of the different kind of categories we had for the supervision piece of it.
Interesting. That is crazy. There wasn't an FTO program.
No.
That is absolutely insane.
How are there no fitness standards here?
Wow. So you mentioned doing the homelessness. So these are people experiencing homelessness who are also on probation. So then you guys are going out in teams. What was that like? Because you've mentioned a couple times that it was interesting, to say the least.
It was, yes. So actually my partner for that whole caseload became one of my best friends. So I was like, at least I got you out of the deal. But it was definitely a assignment that was very, very challenging for me. And I was so burnt out. That was one assignment before I decided it was time for me to move on and do something different. But it was basically, I think when I got the caseload, it was near 150 people on my caseload. And I always kind of joked around. I was like, it's like a freaking Easter egg hunt around here, because you get a caseload of people and they're homeless. So they have no address. You have to just go out to all the different camps. And in California, the homeless issue is a epidemic around here because of we can get into all the reasons why or my thoughts on that, but we don't have to go there. So yeah, we would have to just go out to different camps and do the supervision on basically just hoping that we'd find the people. And then they would have to come into a local train station and check in with me once a week. And the things that would happen at that train station, because people would be coming in and they're high or, there's just the mental, it's is it today? Is it the meth or the mental health today? It would just be kind of one of those things where the mental health piece was just such a issue for these individuals. And so we actually even had a social worker on our team. So there was a big team of us that would, obviously we tried to get people into treatment, but as you know, a lot of these folks don't want treatment. So it's just kind of that balancing act of community safety. And is this person going to create 10 calls for service if we don't just take him in right now? So it was just a very interesting role and assignment that I got to play. But towards the end of that, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do this anymore. Cause it's very exhausting. That population just has a lot of unresolved trauma, and they're just, a lot of them don't even want the ones that I worked with, they didn't even want the treatment or the help and the methods that we had available to us.
Yeah, no, and we see this firsthand. Obviously, Florida is another state where the weather is temperate, and it's a large issue in the area where I serve, and I'm sure it is across the state. And you hit the nail on the head with a few different of the things that you mentioned that people don't even think about. It's one thing. So let's say you have a behavioral health unit and you're trying to offer resources to these people. You've got to find them. And like you said, they don't always stay. Some of them will stay, in one primary camp or have one primary area where they feel safe. So they'll go back there. But a lot of times that's not the case. So they could be in this county or that county. And then that you get into all these jurisdictional issues. And then the other problem is right now we have such an epidemic when it comes to the opioids and so forth, with trying to help those that are overdosing. So if you have people in these camps that are have overdosed and you're trying to reach out to them to offer services, again, you can't find them. You've got to have some sort of way to contact them after the fact to get them engaged in services. Yeah, it becomes this huge thing. You don't have to go very far down this road if you don't want to, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the why, which you said, which you mentioned as to why it is such an epidemic out there, because I asked myself the same questions here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an open book with all this stuff. And I always say it's like, that's just in my humble opinion and based on actually being in it. So I think there's a multitude of reasons. I think there are actually agendas in California that are purposefully pushing this, because why would we be giving, clean needles and these sorts of things? Why would we be kind of creating this sentiment that it's okay for people to be doing these sorts of things, rather than funneling the funds into things that truly actually help people get back on their feet? So I think there's a lot of, and I mean, it can come from either party, but I think there's a lot of legislation and things that are making it okay. For example, there were points where I would find dope on people and it's like, well, what's the point of me even writing this up? This person I had one gal who had, I want to say it was 12 or 13 open. She had like 12 or 13 warrants, and they were all for health and safety code violations around just possession of methamphetamine. And I was like, why would I waste my time? Because if I take her into the jail is just going to kick her. So there were a lot of things going on too, where it was like, well, what's the point to even hook this person? Because literally they're going to get back out before the ink dries on my report. And then wow. Like they're going to just have 14 warrants that I now have to clear. So
right.
It's like, why don't we just leave the warrant open in case they create a call for service and we really need to take them later? So there were these sorts of kind of nuances around crafty ways that we would address these things. But I think overall, we have the issue of the legislation in California, and I think it was Prop 47 that did this in California, which reduced all these things to misdemeanors. Whereas, I'm not saying that that we should necessarily hook everybody who has a little dope on them, but at the same time, it's like and half the time, even with the homeless people, they didn't care about going to jail. It was like a vacation. So I think that the second issue is the treatment programs and the ineffectiveness of the treatment programs. I actually, part of the reason I left law enforcement and probation is like morally and ethically, I was like I'll give an example. I had, this was right before I left, I had a very short stint in the juvenile unit, and I can't remember if it was a court order. I know it was a juvenile placement, and I had to drive this, I think she was 15 or something, to the Bay Area, which is 2 hours from where we were, and take her to this home, if you will. I do air quotes because I just knew. I walked in and I was like, this is not the vibe. This is not the answer. And she ran off, and it was like the sex trafficking stuff. And so I was like, this isn't working. There's something broken here with this system. And I felt somewhat responsible because I was ordered to take her there and I left her there. And then she ran off and ended up, and this is something she had been doing prior. But my point here is that the treatment programs that we were directed to order people into, and that was part of the responsibility, is making sure people were showing up to their outpatient, or maybe they're an inpatient or whatever sort of treatment. I can't remember on one hand people where I'm like, oh yeah, they successfully completed and everything's great now. Right. So I think it's a multitude of things, but those are the two main things that kind of come up for me.
Okay. No, those are both powerful, and they're both striking home with exactly conversations I've had in the last week. In fact, I just had a conversation. I was involved in something yesterday. I can't go into a lot of details on it, but the second story that you offered there with the young lady who's the juvenile, and it is so frustrating because the system really fails them on every level. In fact, in some cases, the best you can hope for is that they get arrested. And for like a juvenile in Florida, that's 21 days, because that's the closest you can get them to treatment, which is sadly inadequate and just perpetuates the problem. And like you said, you end up with these human trafficking issues, and then there's all these rules I don't know how far I can go into that. But essentially there's rules that people don't understand as far as the limitations when it comes to keeping them involved in these programs. And because they're, like when you're talking a juvenile, maybe something like they need their phone or whatever, some of that stuff is actually mandated. And so it limits your ability to do anything. So from here, I'd be curious. And so this is kind of why you segued out of doing the probation. So what specifically brought you into kind of what you're doing now, or what'd you do next?
Yeah, there was a couple things that happened. There was just one point where I just noticed, I was like, I'm just so burnt out. I'm like literally dragging my body through. Like I was the type of person that would work all the overtime. And I worked very hard, and I noticed that I was getting cynical. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm 6 years in and I'm already feeling like kind of burnt out and cynical. This is not how I choose to live. And so the part of me knew that there was a better way, and that there was some answers as to, this trauma that I was seeing expressed in people constantly, these painful emotions and these painful patterns I would see, in these kids and in just a lot of the people that I worked with. Especially, I noticed it a lot when I was in the DUI unit, because these are like your everyday average, doing air quotes, average American who just like, jail's not even a deterrent to stop using alcohol, to escape from the reality that you've created. And so I was just determined to figure out what I could do to be a part of the solution rather than just complaining about it all the time. And so this led me to what I'm doing now, which is in relation to like the healing work, the holistic healing stuff, and releasing these trauma and these patterns at that root, because that's what's happening, especially with, we see it. We can use the children, for example. It's like they're just expressing like this deeply rooted trauma. And so when we're just trying to go at it from a very surface level of like, what is it, like the carrot and the stick approach, or like, don't do that or else, it doesn't often work. And we've seen this. And that's why we're seeing this on such a large scale with the rates of crime and the recidivism. Because again, going back to what I noticed with people, the recidivism rates, like, or even just the reoffending when we didn't even take them back to jail, but them violating probation. I don't remember having many people who didn't do that, right? Because these patterns and these traumas, they run deep, and they don't just go away by saying, go away, or I'm just going to drink a bottle of booze and, avoid it for a moment. That stuff's still going to be there. So I was just determined to figure out how to support people with this. So my specialty is working with these emotional patterns and these traumas and helping people release these things, because it goes down to a very like, even the nervous system and how our nervous system responds, how our body responds, even down to, there were times when I'd be in, I mentioned that I had never shot a gun. Like I really had to focus on my breathing because it was something that was just, my system wasn't familiar with it. So when, we're talking about these emotional patterns and these traumas that happen, oftentimes, if we take it kind of back, they can come from a variety of different places. Maybe they're, passed down ancestrally from our parents. I think we can both agree that we've seen families, in the system. And I actually had some times where we'd have multiple people in a house where we'd get like a crew of officers, because we're like, we got 5 people in this house. We may as well go to this house so that we can, just shoot fish in a barrel here. Right.
Yeah, it absolutely happens.
And that just illustrates how this stuff gets passed down. And then that's not even to mention, childhood wounding, when a child is, even in their mother's womb to 7, there's a bunch of research and things around the unconscious and how we get programmed because of our brainwave state. We're functioning in that highly suggestible brainwave state. So we're soaking everything in from our surroundings, from our caregivers, and then it continues to get expressed, especially if it's like unprocessed trauma, because it's trying to be expressed, but we're not getting to it from a place where we can actually neutralize it. And that's the beauty of this type of work, is what we're doing is we're neutralizing it, the charge of it, right? So, even in terms of like, we can speak of it as like, PTSD and things of that nature. We want to neutralize that trigger and that charge, so we're not going into that fight or flight response.
Yeah, no, that's you and I were talking offline. I was just having a conversation with somebody else, and one of the things we went into is the whole ACE test, the adverse childhood experiences, and how those can a lot of times become indicators or become a baseline of the potential for some of these traumas and how it can possibly exhibit as something like PTS or something like that down the line. We've talked a little bit of it. I'd be curious on your thoughts on two things at this point. Let's go down this road first. So because there's kind of two things as I see it, right? So we can go down the road, because I'm sure there's people listening to this that are in law enforcement. And so far our conversation has been around kind of the public and what we do out on the street. And I'm sure already there's a disconnect where people are like, well, that doesn't affect me. That's not my situation. I'm not struggling with, and thank God, but they're maybe not struggling with some sort of addiction, at least not like an opioid addiction or something like that. Yeah. So let's first go down that road. Is there anything, when you talk about how the system has failed, what can the system do? Because we have an issue, right, where the system is set up in such a way that it doesn't do a whole lot in general, right? Everything kind of grinds very slowly. So what can you do when you talk something like, is it a cultural response? Is it like, what do you do when you talk about changing the overall system to the end user? Like when we talk about homelessness or juveniles, et cetera.
Yeah, I think for me, it's part of kind of what I was mentioning. I didn't like the way it didn't feel good to me, the way that the system was set up. I saw it as broken. And so it's like, I'm making a choice instead of complaining about it to really being a part of the change first within myself, right? And really understanding these things and then offering that to people who are ready to receive it. So it's like, if we don't like the way that something is, then we can either complain about it and take a backseat victim role, or we can come up with new paradigms and new creative ways to change it. Because I think that at the end of the day, we can all agree we want to have a harmonious experience. We don't want to be on the streets like fighting with people or, getting poked by needles or, whatever it might be. We don't want any of that going on. There's a certain place where I think that there's certain structures that are absolutely needed, especially with where we are kind of in the evolution of humanity. But I think that as we continue to learn ways in which we don't have to hold on to this stuff and have it be unexpressed and then have it come out as violence or have it come out as, whatever it might be, right? Yeah. We can really utilize new ways that are, a lot of them are now even just getting backed by more and more research and more science. And then also at the very down to earth level, like people are just feeling better. And I can speak for myself because if you had met me 10 years ago, I was not in the same place that I am now. And so I feel like a willingness to actually take some action too. It's a combination of like that inner work and then taking that action if you do want to create something different here.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So taking that to the societal level, then if I'm hearing you correctly, the goal would be that as we educate, as we have more people in, not necessarily you, but people like you who are like, hey, this is the answer. And then take that back to the system and go into a lot of these counseling type roles and so forth. So that rather than doing what we've always done, we now introduce some of these deeper level ways of dealing with trauma. Would that be, am I wording that correctly?
Yeah, I really like that. And one thing, kind of a metaphor I give, like, I think therapy definitely has its place, but I've had therapy sessions before. So what I can speak to is the way, like metaphorically speaking, like if we just rip the Band-Aid off, let's activate the story. We can talk about what's going on or what's wrong. And then it's like, okay, cool. Well, glad we could talk about it. Bye. See you next week. But what I'm talking about is, okay, we ripped the Band-Aid off. Well, let's get to the root of what's causing this. And let's actually just release that from your body right now. So we don't have to keep recreating it. We don't have to keep talking about it. We don't have to keep living in that reality. But it's something that is new to a lot of people because we've not been taught to really connect with ourselves in this way, first and foremost, and what true healing really means. And then it oftentimes even, comes out in the physical body. And that to me is what dis-ease is, right? It's the body just expressing these low vibrational experiences that have been unprocessed. And that now it's coming out as different ailments because the body's like, excuse me, like, can we get your attention, please?
Yes.
Because it's, let's say, for example, if we go back to like that PTSD example, like we have a traumatic experience and we get flooded with all the different hormones involved from that situation. Our cortisol is all off the charts and our nervous system is just like, probably if we're talking to officers, in fight mode, like we're going in. And then it's like after that, because that's not like a normal day, right? Like most law enforcement officers, it's like you're dealing with the 1% of the 1% that can't seem to understand it. And you don't know what you're going into when you get that call, right? You know a little bit, you don't know everything. And so it's like after that, then you're just kind of like, the body's just had this flood of all this stuff going on. And let's say there was some trauma or, maybe there was like, had to go hands on, or there was a shooting or whatever it is. Now that is, imprinted as a memory, right? It's that trauma is in the energy field. So a lot of people who experience like the PTSD, it's actually rather easy than we think it is to just clear that imprinting out of the memory, the energy field. So it's a neutral memory, right? It's not you're not recreating it, you're not feeling it. It's not running subtly in the background, if that makes sense.
It does. And following that logic, then it wouldn't be a triggering memory either anymore, correct?
Correct. Yeah. One of my mentors shared this story around these ancient healers. I think they were like kind of in the shamanic kind of, I guess, energy, if you will. But what they would do is if there was any type of trauma that occurred, they would literally clear it right after the event. So, but most of us don't do that, right? We have this happen and then sometimes we'll go talk about it. But to me, talking about it just reactivates it. Like sometimes you get an emotional release from it and it feels good, but I can say the majority of us probably just continue to talk about it and we're still kind of feeling it at that cellular level. I'm talking about getting that harmonization and that neutralizing of that heaviness at a cellular level so you're not carrying that around.
Very good. Something you hit on there that I think, in fact, Shay Sparks is a friend of mine. I'm not sure if that's how you found me or not, but Shay was on my program and she actually does a lot of similar things to what you're talking about. And we had this whole conversation around what you call disease or dis-ease. And really it's something you do see with law enforcement, myself included. You see it so often when we get into like gastrointestinal type illnesses, all these different types of illnesses. So can you go a little deeper in that? Because I really think that hits home for a lot of listeners as we kind of segue into specifically for law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll just preface this, I don't claim to be a medical professional. I'm just talking about energy and how like this expresses itself in the physical body. So I'm not giving any diagnosis, recommendations, all the things, all the things we got to say.
All
right?
the things. Yes.
All the things, disclaimers. Yes. So absolutely. And I think that I'm just kind of feeling into where to start here. Cause I was sensing a lot too with the heart as well. Cause I think that at least a lot of officers that I worked with had a lot of like heart issues and blood pressure issues.
So much so that like in the state of Florida, there actually is a heart bill that allows you to retire earlier, provided you didn't have heart issues before you came in the career. Now, some of us, I actually have, I was born with heart issues, so I wouldn't qualify, but yeah, it actually is a, thing for those who didn't have heart issues before the career. It was specifically codified in state law.
Yeah. And then you mentioned like the intestinal stuff as well. So this, each even our organs produce different emotions as well. So if you're in a heightened event, you're going to release certain emotions and certain chemicals in the body, and it's going to, flood the body once again. So I can give an example too of someone who I is actually family. I won't disclose any crazy details, but this person has had a lot of stuff with heartbreak, and I know that this is tied, and has had to have many open heart surgeries, and so I don't believe there's any coincidence here. So when we're talking about, even down to you have to go to a coroner's call, that's not something that people have to see on a regular basis. But oftentimes too, and let me know if you can relate to this, it's like we make light of it so that we can get through it, right? We joke around about it.
Absolutely.
Or, we have to like see the light in the darkest of situations, but it's not when we're taking it down to like a foundational level of everything is energy. Going into like a scene where there's a dead body, that's dense as hell. That is dense, dense, dense. And especially, if there was trauma involved in it, like if it wasn't just kind of like a natural death, then you have all of that and you're feeling that, right? And as humans, we feel these things in our body, and we can kid ourselves and say that it doesn't affect us. And that's what a lot of us do, myself included. There were times where I put on that hard shell, right? Because that's sometimes what you have to do in order to be able to go into a certain situation. But then it's like, okay, after that, like, are you really okay? And have you actually processed the emotions that came up from the specific situation that you just went into? Like, we can say that maybe we weren't feeling scared or terror, but I know every time, even when I like got really good at clearing houses, anytime I had to pull my gun and clear a house, like there was a certain level of like adrenaline I felt, and sometimes a bit of fear. And I feel like it's a natural thing. But then it's like, after we remove ourselves from that very elevated situation, especially these situations that, again, the majority of the population don't experience these on a regular daily basis. When we pull ourselves out of that, it's like, okay, what feelings did that bring up in me? What is like, can we check in with the body? Can we see like, how am I feeling? Do I need a day off? Do I need to like, decompress? And what ways do I do that where I'm actually able to just allow my nervous system to relax? And do I need to release some of these emotions? Because and kind of circling back to your question, I truly believe the reason for the heart issues and the gut issues, it's suppression, right? And that's simply what depression is. It's suppressed emotions. And then we continue to protect ourselves, because that's the job of our unconscious and our ego, is to protect ourselves at all costs, is to protect us. And so when we go into these modes, and then we don't necessarily compartmentalize in a way that we're able to process what happened and digest what happened. See, it's like we didn't digest what happened, so now it's affecting our digestion. There's no coincidence. And so it doesn't mean you have to go back and relive those things, but it also an acknowledgement and a releasing and moving through the emotion, so the emotion doesn't become stuck in your body. So I'll give another quick example, because if we're talking about energy and vibration, and there's a really good book on this. It's kind of scientific-ish. It's called Power versus Force by David Hawkins. And he talks about the scale of emotions. So like, for example, fear, shame, guilt, unworthy, those are really low frequency emotions. We can all tune into those, and it's kind of like, we don't really want to feel those, right? Versus like love and joy and those emotions, like we like that. I think most of us can agree. We'd rather feel joy and love versus feeling shame, guilt, So when we have those low frequency emotions trapped in our body, it's going to cause problems with our physical body. And then we start seeing those as symptoms in the body if we don't pay attention and we don't address it and we don't move through whatever we're kind of needing to move through.
I love it. And that's something, like I said, my friend me and her had a couple conversations along these lines. Let me ask you though, when you talk about this releasing and moving through this, I think one of the first kickbacks you get is that people start thinking clinically again, right? They think it's them and someone in a white coat they got to sit down with. So what does that look like? Is that something people can do on their own? Is that something that requires an expert? What does that look like? And is it a mix of both?
I feel like it's a mix of both. I feel like it's getting real with yourself on what is right for you. And sometimes I have people that help me move through stuff, because sometimes our blind spots, again, sometimes we don't fully want to see them. We know they're there and we just need a little reflection and a little help. And then we have that moment where we're like, oh my gosh, you're so right. So I think it's a mix of both. I think it's really getting real with yourself on, is this something that I'm resisting taking a look at? is this something I need support with? Or is it just right for me to just like, okay, this happened and I'm just going to let it go and move on? So I feel like it just really depends on what it is. And it's not one size fits all. That's why I always say like this type of healing work isn't one size fits all. So the way I'm going to approach each client session is different dependent on where they're at and what they're needing support with. So to answer your question on, can people release this stuff on their own? Yeah, I truly believe we all have an ability to do this, but it's also learning certain ways that work for you. And if this is super new to you, then, maybe even some of the things I'm saying are kind of like a bit new or a bit foreign, which is totally fine because we're all, just kind of starting from where we're at and we're learning as we go on what works for us. So, for example, if I were to work with somebody who was newer to this type of work and they're like, okay, this happened and I'm feeling this is causing issues for me. And I'm noticing that it's still showing up because these things will then show up on a repeat loop where it's still being held in your body. And so what we would do, because we don't always have to like go back into it. Sometimes it's helpful to kind of like replay it out and work through whatever needs to be worked through. But most of the time it's like, okay, I'm going to choose to let this go. And then I'll guide people through a process on how I call it recoding the energy field. And we're doing some recoding work on releasing it out. Because if everything's energy, then we can easily just let it go and we don't have to keep holding on to it. And oftentimes it's just a willingness and an acknowledgement that it's still there. And I work with it's a field of energy. So we have our conscious mind, our unconscious, and we also have a super conscious, or you can call it your higher self. And this energy contains all information all about like all events you've had, all emotions that are being held in your body. And so we can work with this energy to release out these dense pockets of energy or memories or whatever it might be that is causing this to show up in your life in a way that doesn't feel good to you, because ultimately we want to be able to really enjoy life and feel good most of the time. We're humans. Absolutely. We're always going to have emotions, but
yeah, no, that's powerful. And I think the part I really liked, or the part that really resonates with me, is the fact, like you said, it's different for everybody and you got to kind of start where you're at. But the most important thing, I think, then, or the logical follow-up to that would be do something, right? The answer isn't to ignore it, because that's what leads to these physical issues and so much of what we've been talking about. One of the things you talk a lot about is healthy relationships. As we segue into that, let me start with the question, what does a healthy relationship even look like? And I think this is applicable to a lot of law enforcement and kind of feeds into the other side of the equation when they're off the job.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that came to mind, and I don't know if people are going to like the answer to this or not, but first and foremost, it's the relationship with yourself. Do you have a healthy relationship with yourself? What is the narrative going on? Like that inner talk. And we all have like this little voice in our head, right, that we hear. And what is the narrative going on? Are you even kind to yourself? Do you do things out of
important, Amanda?
Yeah. Do you do things out of obligation? Do you do things out of people pleasing? Do you do things out of fear? How do you treat yourself? How do you talk to yourself? And it's so foundational, because I've found that the way I show up and the way that my relationship is with myself is literally indicative of the people in my life and how they treat me. Because it's like, you probably noticed this, where there's certain people, and I'm just going to be completely blunt, that you can talk to in a certain way and others you cannot talk to in a certain way, right? Yep. Because they hold themselves to this high standard, whereas someone else who allows someone to, maybe it's like, hey, can you do this? Can you do this? And they're just always like, yes, no problem. It's like, it's a thing. We can be real and say it's a thing. So for me, it first comes back to that relationship with yourself and taking inventory of, especially for those in law enforcement, are you nourishing yourself? Are you taking enough time off? What's the identification here? Because it's like, who are you outside of this field, this job, this career? Like, if everything was stripped away, who are you? And that's why I always like chuckle when you meet somebody and they're like, oh, what do you do? It's not like, oh, who are you? Like, as a person, as a soul, what is the essence of who you are? It's always like, what do you do? It's like, well, I think at the deeper level too, and this ties into relationships, I feel like we are craving that deeper level of human connection. Sometimes we just don't know how. because we've been so disconnected from ourselves for far too long. So connecting back in with yourself and getting real with yourself on what is it that you deeply desire? Like, let's say you had a magic wand, everything was wiped off, money was no object. What would you be doing? Who would you be? How would you be showing up every day? And you can really kind of start to take inventory with, well, why aren't you showing up in that way right now? What kind of stories do you have running telling you that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to be good enough or in order to make it in life? There was a lot of things I had to deal with around my own ego when I left law enforcement, because I was like, there's a certain level of like respect that we received. Sometimes there's a certain level of disrespect, but there's also a certain level of respect. And once I left, I had done a really short stint at my family's company. And it was like, I was like, oh my gosh, like, I feel like the level of respect I received like went from 100 to 0. And it was so interesting for me to really kind of rebuild myself up and become and embody that confidence and the way that I treat myself and the way that I show up. And also what I say yes to and what I say no to. Like anywhere we have that like leaky energy in our life to where we're doing things again out of shoulds, obligations, or pressure, oftentimes that'll wear on your body too. So first and foremost, with yourself. And if you want, we can circle into relationships like family and, with spouses and things as well, if you feel that would be beneficial. But that was the first thing that popped up.
Well, I do think it'd be beneficial, but I do love what you're saying, because I think it's resonating even with me, and I'm sure it will with the listeners as well, because it's huge. In fact, I just posted something on social media this week about this, and that was the whole premise of the reel was, who are you? Because, like I'm weighing and I serve in law enforcement right now, but that's not who I am. And if Lord forbid something happens tomorrow and I'm not in this career anymore, but you're right. For all the negative out there that we hear or we see or people deal with people that see the badge, see the uniform, and there's this negative reaction, there's a fair amount of positive reaction, especially in certain areas. Like I'm very blessed to be in an area where, you may get free coffee and free dinner out of, that's just the nature of the people. They love what you do and they love what you represent, and they want to find ways to show that. And then I can just imagine that once you step away from this career and you're left with just yourself, if you're not familiar or sure on who you are, you're going to struggle. Before we kind of segue into the other relationships and so forth, is this in line with, I love the phrase you use, activate your inner badassery. Is this in line with that thinking then?
Yes, because I'll throw in a little kind of my esoteric energy here, but I feel like we all are templated for something unique. We're not all the same. It's like down to our fingerprints are different. So I feel that each of our souls and each of our essences are 100% different. So if we're trying to be someone else, if we're trying to fit into some sort of mold because we've been told we had to, be it a job, be it a relationship, whatever, it usually doesn't work out. And oftentimes it's like, it doesn't work out on the external, but then we feel it at that deep soul level, that deep level. And so I feel like we all, because again, like going back to me leaving law enforcement, it was like, it took the wind out of my sails for a moment. There were moments where I was like, did I just mess this up royally? What did I do? I sold my home. I quit my job. It's like on Dumb and Dumber, our pets' heads are falling off. Like, what's happening? And I just had to trust that I was following that inner knowing and really had to connect back in with that confidence and bring that out in my own unique way, because no one else was going to do it for me. And every time I tried to search outside myself, it didn't work out so well. So I just feel like it's just, I feel it's available to each of us. I have finally arrived at a place of such peace to where I'm like, okay, I get it. It all makes sense because I'm not fighting myself anymore. And we can all connect back in with ourselves and really take inventory of, again, the stories. Like, are they even yours? Because oftentimes they're just passed down, or they're just societal obligations that we've been told that we have to subscribe to. And I just don't play by those rules. So I don't know, maybe it feels good. So it's working out now.
Well, there you go. That's an important part of it. So since we're getting a little short on time, let me go down this road instead. What then would you say to the person that this is resonating with, right? The person who heard the relationships and heard your answer, and they're like, yeah, I see this and I know this about myself, and I have this negative self-talk and, all these things, right? And we have all done it. And I myself have probably the guiltiest among us. But that being said, what would be those first one or two actionable steps that you would say to that person? Like, what do they do next if they're listening to this podcast and hearing what we're saying?
Yeah, I'll give a really practical thing that you can do, and it'll be two parts. So I would recommend really kind of tuning into what it is you actually choose and what you desire. Because oftentimes that's why we tend to get the average of everything, is because we're just kind of in that unconscious autopilot rather than being that creator. So if, again, going back to my question, like if you could just make it all appear, and I'm talking about that feeling of that, how do you want to feel? Like if you're identifying right now, things haven't been going that well. I'm feeling kind of tired, depleted, fill in the blank, whatever it is. Well, on the flip side of that, how is it that you choose to feel? Like, what is that end result? Like if you were to say, I choose the end result of stepping into a life I love and like really expressing my true self, like closing your eyes and just seeing if you can kind of feel into what that would feel like and maybe what that would look like, and allowing that to come through, and then writing some things down as well. But there's such a power in tapping into that energy of if it's already happened now. And then on the secondary aspect of it, then it's like, okay, where's the resistance to that? And then we can start to take a bit of a inventory around like, okay, is it something where I'm feeling this sort of unworthiness and I'm kind of feeling it in my stomach, bringing some awareness to those things. And we can start to kind of pull the threads on where's like the gap here? Where's the gap here from this is what I'm choosing, and I know that this is possible. I just don't know how to get from A to B. And so really getting clear on what it is that you have been kind of taking on as a sort of identity structure that is causing you to maybe even play this sort of role or this character that isn't you and never was. You just did it for a while. That's okay. Right, wherever you're at right now is perfect. Like you're not broken. You don't need to be fixed, but it's about like, if you want to create in a conscious way, what does that even look like? Because we haven't been taught this stuff. We're not taught that you're a creator of your own reality and that you can either create on unconscious autopilot and just get an average of everything, or you can actually really tap into whatever it is that's inside of you that wants to come out and just unleash it. It's just that it sounds like, it sounds like it's as simple as it sounds, but then sometimes when you choose it, other things have to fall apart in order for that to be able to show up. So it's like when I chose some of these things, certain relationships had to resonate away because those relationships were not in alignment with what I was choosing for how I choose to show up as a friend and for what I choose to have as far as my friendships. And so actually that happened lately. They were like a relationship. I released a relationship with a boyfriend and multiple friendships because it just wasn't in alignment with, first of all, how I show up as a friend and how I choose to have my friends show up. So there could be sorts of things like that to where you're saying yes to things that are no. So I would recommend taking inventory on that as well. And I'll give one little tip on how you can, because, you can work with an energy healing practitioner like myself if you feel called, but a quick way that you can kind of do it in the moment. Like, let's say you've just had a experience and you felt this surge of heaviness in your body and you're noticing it. So you can pause in the moment and you can start to breathe in through your nose to a slow, like 5 or 6 second count, and breathing out through the mouth with an intention to let it go, with an intention to have that release from your body, and just asking your body. Our intention is so powerful. Intention is just game changing. So once we have that intention, we can really work through some of those things. And if it feels like it's really deeply rooted, then you can, if you feel guided to seek support, then you can get some support for a bit deeper level of work. But the breath is so powerful because it allows this pause rather than it allowing the story to continue replaying and run away with us. It pauses us in the moment and it presents us in the moment, because most of us are just, and I've been there too, where it's like, I didn't want to look at it because it felt too painful. And so I would just go about my day to day. But when I notice something coming up, it's like, okay, can I just sit with it for a minute? Because maybe Like it's there to support me. Maybe my body was just trying to save me, support me, whatever it is, just trying to just be with it for a moment rather than running from it.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. And I think that really will help, especially law enforcement, because like you said, so often we know there's an issue and we choose the path of just avoiding it, thinking it's never going to show up again. And like I said, I just had a guest that we spoke this morning, and he told the downside, which the listeners will probably hear that podcast right before this one, where he told the eventual downside of what happens when we ignore it and what that can kind of show itself as. So, a couple last things, a couple last questions here. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but let's talk a little bit about your podcast, New Earth Visionaries. Tell us a little bit about it. What can the listeners expect?
I love that. Yeah, it's called New Earth Visionaries. I actually started it at the beginning of the year, and it's really just about having conversations, kind of like we're having now, but just bringing these new paradigms and these new awarenesses. So I have a variety of guests on the show, and we had one, I think this was a couple of weeks ago, that a lot of listeners really resonated with. It was all about navigating these cycles of grief and dense emotions, because again, we're humans, so we're always going to be experiencing emotions. That's never going to go away. As much of the healing work that we do, like we're emotional beings. So it's just really about bringing an awareness to new ways of doing things and new ways of being that feel more expansive to us, so we can really just enjoy being here. I truly don't believe that life needs to be this tumultuous, like god awful place on this planet. Like, yeah, there's some stuff that goes on here that's not ideal, but really just being a part of bringing these new higher vibrational paradigms to the planet. So that's really the premise and intention of my podcast. So
I love that. And it also speaks to, I mean, yes, there's always going to be some negative things maybe in the world around us, but that doesn't mean it has to be us. Like we can live outside of that, or find something deeper within ourselves. My last two questions. My one question I ask everybody who's a guest on the podcast, we've touched on a lot of things already that probably answer this question, but if you're going to boil it down, what is the one takeaway, the one thing that law enforcement officers can do that's going to make a difference in their personal lives?
What I mentioned, the relationship with yourself. I feel like that is the most important thing. At least it's been the most important thing in my life, just connecting back in with yourself and the way that you navigate that relationship with yourself and how you show up for yourself and how you treat others, how others treat you. It's oftentimes that, a reflection of what's going on. So just really, really getting clear, like this, what's showing up right now, is this who I choose to be? Like, is this the most expansive version of myself? And there's nothing right, or we weren't given a rule book for this thing, whatever this thing is, And so I don't necessarily think that there's just like, it's not black and white, and just start to navigate what works for you in the form of just really stepping into that version of yourself that just feels so authentic and so potent and just so true for you, because it's just different for each of us. So I would just recommend that being the relationship with yourself being first and foremost. And then, a practical thing would be getting some breath work. If you're new to energy work, breath work's a really cool way to start, because it's something that's very kind of more tangible to people. Sometimes, with the energy work, kind of ease you into it a little bit, but super, super powerful. And those would be my two recommendations.
I think that's wonderful. And yeah, sometime we'll have to see, maybe I can get you back on. I want to go deeper into the breaths thing, because that is so important and something I've talked about a few times, because I even saw it in myself in dealing with some traumatic events and stuff. What a difference just learning to breathe, which you would think would be simple. But as when the book, we talked about at the very beginning, it's maybe not as simple as we think. What is the best way for people to connect with you, Amanda?
Yeah. First, I would love to be back on. We could even do a mini breathwork session if you feel like your listeners would enjoy something like that. That'd be kind of fun.
Would love to.
Like a de-stress breathwork session. And they can find me. My website's probably the best place to connect with me, which is amandamonnier.com. So you can find me on my website. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email too. I know sometimes this work is very fresh to people, very new, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Very good. I'll be sure to link all that up. And you're doing a lot of great things. So I do encourage everybody to go to the website, which I'll have linked up so you can spell Monnier correctly, but that will all be on there for them. So Amanda, thank you so much for coming on. I cannot believe this hour has flown by.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wayne. I've had such a good time chatting with you. It's just been so effortless and so flowy. So great. And thank you everyone for listening. It's been awesome.
Thanks.
So how was that? I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Amanda. I tell you, it is such a privilege to be able to sit down and bring you these conversations each and every week. The people that I can just sit here and ask them the questions and kind of get into their mindset. And I like to try to bring you stuff from all different walks of life, right? And all different backgrounds and so forth. Because what works for you, what works for me, it's going to be different, right? And I like to get different perspectives and I like to get different ideas. So I hope you're enjoying that. Next week, it's going to be a completely different guest, completely different mindset in some ways. And then there's always a lot of similarities, but something that's actionable for each and every one of us. If you want to know more about what's going on, always be sure to go to On the Blue Line, ontheblueline.com. You can follow us on social media at On the Blue Line Podcast on most platforms, with the exception of Twitter, which is at On the Blue Line and the number 1. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week in the interview room. But in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.